Hello, and welcome back to Building New Music. In this part, we'll discuss the writing process, and I'll show you the complete process of writing this piece. Sped up, of course. This process totaled about 12 hours of recorded footage, split over 10 different sessions of writing, not counting the tweaks I forgot to record or any external discussions or planning that I've done. This all took place over just over a month of real time. Ultimately, writing a piece is a lot of work. If you're a composer, it's probably work that you enjoy, but it's work nonetheless. I was nice to myself when I set a duration of 5 minutes and only 4 instruments, and even then, it still took a significant time investment. The main thing I'll say on this is, don't worry about how long your work takes. As long as you're making any deadlines you have, any amount of work is fine. Always remember that everyone works at their own rates. Not everyone has the same amount of free time or energy after all, and not every piece will need the same amount of pure labour hours put into it, and that's okay. As my music is fairly focused on small details and features little repetition, it tends to be somewhat labour intensive, but that doesn't mean it's any better or worse than anyone else's music. In fact, you should generally avoid trying to compare yourself to other composers. Every composer has a different background of education and experience that will fundamentally change how they work and how they write. And different styles take different amounts of energy. No matter what you do, you're not anyone else. This is an art, not a science, and trying to find the one true way to do it will always be somewhat pointless. Crucially, your writing process is yours. With that out of the way, we can start discussing things from a practical standpoint. In the modern world, with programs like Sibelius and any DAW, or just a piano or your voice, it's very easy to listen back to what you've written. And this is great. In terms of judging pacing, there's no substitute for hearing things this way. However, remember that mock-ups are mock-ups, and not a full picture of your piece. Writing too much based only on what you hear can become a bit of a flaw. It limits your world to what you're capable of depicting in the mock-up. And just like there's no substitute for hearing, there's also no substitute for physical instruments. Unless you're watching this from the future, a computer just can't simulate the full complexity of any one instrument. Only the instrument in question can do that, and even then, the experience of playing an instrument is markedly different from the experience of hearing it. Don't let the capabilities of your MIDI mockup or piano reduction limit your world, especially in the case of contemporary music. I would also recommend avoiding over-listening. Remember, most people are only going to hear a piece once, and while you may hear your piece probably hundreds of times over, you should try to remember this. Familiarity breeds contempt. You may find that after the 10th listen, you get sick of a certain part of the piece, or conversely, you may turn around on something and come to like it, but only after the 15th listen. This sort of situation is unavoidable, and there's nothing wrong with changing things based on these judgments, but spending too much time changing things around can become a real danger. The more time you spend on it, the more you'll grow to be annoyed by other parts of your piece. And the more you change based on these judgments, the more you'll lose sight of what you wanted originally from the piece. There are all sorts of discussions to have about whether or not this is a bad thing, but too often I find that the desire to tweak and tweak until you like something is an endless losing battle. Perfectionism is a genuine danger. One trick that I found useful to avoid this is to take notes after every session. Take note of what you like and what you want to keep, and take note of what you might not like and want to change. Your impressions on a certain section or element may change day to day, but it's important to remember, no matter when you had this thought, it's still valid. With this technique, even if you get sick of something, you'll know from these previous comments that there's value to what's there, even if you might not see it now. And conversely, you may find yourself changing your mind on one of the negative comments. Even if you feel more or less confident on different days, this technique will help you remember why you were writing things in the first place. Of course, if you find yourself fully, consistently disagreeing with something you've written before, you're welcome to change things. But you're also under no obligation to change things based only on snap judgments. And keeping these things in writing can help you resist the urge to constantly tweak things. I also recommend planning what you want to do in the next session while doing this. It helps keep you focused and prevent you from forgetting what you are doing, rather than writing purely as a reaction to what comes before. Another way to avoid the problems of perfectionism is to avoid being too sentimental. Sometimes, if something isn't working, it doesn't need minor tweaking. It needs cutting outright. I've had many moments where I realised this far too late. Started on a section that was probably a mistake, and either left it in to the detriment of the piece, or wasted far too much time trying to make it work before eventually cutting it. There's nothing wrong with making cuts, or major modifications, or even going against what you originally had planned altogether. Try not to let yourself fall so in love with an idea that you can't let it go, and try not to let yourself feel bad if something doesn't work out. Everything is a learning process. Even if an entire day's work gets cut, that just means you now know what you want for your piece even more. Remember as well that there's two parts to every piece: the small-scale individual moments and the shape of the piece as a whole. Some things may work in the small scale, but not in the large scale. And some things may sound bad individually even if they work structurally. It's important to balance your focus between these two aspects. A piece with individually interesting elements that don't make sense structurally, or a piece with a rock-solid and well-considered structure but lacking interesting moments, are both things you want to avoid. Listening and reflecting on the piece as a whole, as well as just individual sections, is very important to maintaining this balance. If you find something that satisfies one angle but not another, it can be a hard decision on whether or not to keep it, but you have more options than just cutting it or keeping it. Think outside of the box. Perhaps you can move an interesting section somewhere else to make it cohere structurally. Or does the structure of what's around it need changing in order to accommodate this moment? Or for the opposite situation, perhaps the structure of your piece may need to be changed in order to allow something interesting to develop. Think of all the different ways you could do this. Or try going back and rewriting this section. Perhaps coming at it from a different perspective will allow for something interesting to develop. This is why I recommend allowing certain things to develop on their own. Even in tightly planned pieces, being flexible is always important. You can't read the future, and new problems, as well as new interesting ideas, will always emerge when you're writing. It's important to embrace this. Allow your plans to change, allow attention to be drawn to new and interesting things, and allow yourself to be critical of what you're writing. There's no point robotically following your plan if something far more exciting is emerging. Always take note of these things, and always be willing to accommodate them if you feel like it's necessary. A lot of my advice comes from a specific angle. The number one thing is to avoid getting discouraged. While there will always be moments where this does happen, nothing puts a damper on your compositional process more than losing faith in your ability to write a good piece. But what should you do if you do get discouraged? Personally, I recommend going back to the things that give you inspiration, as we discussed in the first episode. Take a break from composing and go back to the things that you enjoy, that make you want to write music. In my case, I like to go on walks, hang out with friends, and reflect on things I hear and feel then. Often, what you need is a new idea or a new perspective, and taking these breaks can help you get these things back into your mind, and move you from a mindset of just working to a mindset of idea generation. Listening to more music also helps with this. Try to make sure that you're hearing more things than just your piece, so that you're able to get some perspective on what you're hearing, and to make sure you don't just get sick of what you're writing. And as always, it's important to discuss with other people if you can. Whether this is with performers for any questions about practicality, or other composers for questions about craft, pacing, and feedback. A second pair of ears is never a bad thing. Even friends or relatives who aren't musicians can help you here, which is why making sure you have MIDI mockups or playable piano reductions is important. If this isn't possible for you, cross-reference other pieces. For instrumental concerns, look for difficult solo pieces and see what limits they find. And in other situations, try to find pieces that reflect ideas and textures from your piece in interesting ways. These might help you think of new angles, explore new techniques, and gain more confidence in what you're looking for. While you shouldn't be taking from pieces wholesale, plagiarism is of course a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with taking inspiration, so long as the final product is your own. Remember that you're your own composer, and whatever you find in other pieces and in your own is unique to you. There are limits to what can be learned with just independent research, of course. Some things simply need you to ask directly. Saxophone multiphonics, in the case of my piece, are often specific to each instrument and each performer. They often need to be found through direct experimentation. To accommodate that, I wrote in temporary notations, leaving notes to change them once I was able to contact my performers. When you finalise your piece, I recommend trying to notate things as correctly as possible, but in this stage of the piece, it's more important to depict what sound you're looking for than trying to be correct on something you're not sure of. Eventually, as you write, you'll find yourself building new instincts for the piece. The more you write in this way, the easier it becomes to expand on things. You may find a very strong picture of the shape of your piece emerging, which may vary from how you planned it, or may stay roughly the same. You may find that things that are originally strange to you become second nature. If you keep writing and keep these tips in mind, you'll often be surprised by how well a piece comes together, and eventually you'll find yourself at a point where the piece is coming to an end. At this point, you should move on to the final stage of your piece, addressing any issues that showed up in writing and notating things improper. We'll discuss these things in the next part, but until then, thank you for watching.